Hey Minions, welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Faction Factory, I want to highlight the Sphinxes by LordMewtwo73. The Sphinxes are a faction that owns up to the concept of the riddle of the Sphinx, incorporating other players into the outcome of your turn, and establishing a mind game as often as possible. Now, to understand the appeal of this faction to me, you need to understand something about me that no one in any corner of my life knows, not even my wife, something that I am revealing for the first time right now. I like puzzles. Logic puzzles, ciphers, riddles, mind games, escape rooms, you name it, I really enjoy them. As you take a moment to process that shocking revelation, I want to talk about how the idea of a riddle affects Smash Up. When you are affected by another player's decisions, if they go rogue, it can create a bit of a legacy impact for Game 2 with that person. Will you expect them to behave accordingly or differently? Will a rogue act more like a wizard, or do they have a legacy of unworthiness too? It's too difficult to determine ahead of time, which is what makes this faction interesting. I always enjoy these types of factions because they make the opponents matter, and I always want to write down what I think they will do on Papyrus so that I can score myself after the game. So let's see how this plays out in practice. I will introduce their minions in order because I think it builds towards the payoff of their leader. First, we have the Grand Seer, who is like a mini-spy mixed with an enchantress. Now, it's important to note that this faction is coming in a post-Disney context where draw is extremely popular, and any recruit who draws a guaranteed card is going to be above baseline because it's common for recruits to fulfill a condition to get that card. However, for the purposes of Faction Factory, I like to look more at the idea of a faction rather than the final numbers, and I think that the Sphinxes are in a tough spot because they rely on draw to make their mechanic work to its full potential, so it makes sense that the recruits would draw a card for reasons we'll see in a bit. But think of this as stage 1. The recruit gives you a card with increasing certainty that it is a really good one. Next is Royal Sphinx, who nets another card, offset by the fact that all players draw a card. Royal Sphinx then offers another player a choice. Either they let you draw a card, or the Sphinx gets a power counter. It's an interesting trade-off because the more cards you have, the more options you have, but the more power you have, the less options you need. However, power can backfire, but double, however, when you have 3 of these soldiers out, the potential of drawing 3 cards every turn is very scary, as is the idea of advancing on 3 bases simultaneously and forcing another player to choose which one to break. But think of this as stage 2. I've now potentially gained 2 more cards for a total of 3. The Elite has an interesting ability. After another player draws a card due to an ability, you get to draw a card. Whether it's yours or theirs, it doesn't matter. It's 1 per turn to avoid infinite loops, but this is the type of ability that, as I said before, I want to see in the game, reacting to draw events. Now this raises an important question. Are cards that are placed into your hand drawn? The wording has been extremely inconsistent, with at least 3 different terms that I know of besides draw, but for the purposes of this custom and my general desire for behaviors not words, I'm going to rule that they are all the same, because otherwise you have nearly identical cards behaving differently for anachronistic reasons. There should be a term for that. Many of the other Sphinx cards will trigger the Elite, and that escalation comes to a head with the Great Old One. The Great Old One's talent has a chance to play an extra card per turn, contingent on another player guessing wrong as to its type. This is very interesting to think about, because let's assume a standard distribution for a moment. The more cards I have drawn, the more likely it is that I've drawn a card you fear, so you might guess that card's type to avoid me playing it. But the more cards I've drawn, the more options I have, which makes it likely that there are both minions and actions you should fear. If you've ever played Not Alone, which I highly recommend, you can see how this back and forth begins to evolve. If the player guesses right, both players draw a card, which triggers Malicious Arbitrator. I'll have more to say about this later, because we need to look at what some of the Sphinx actions do that I could be playing. One of my favorite parts of Custom Faction Month was guessing the double features, and I knew right away that 2 Futures was a double feature, and not just because it has 2 in the title. This card lets a rival split the top 4 cards of your deck into 2 piles, in an I split you choose style mechanic. Presumably, the cards are in piles of 2, but there's also the possibility of 3 in 1, if the player really wants to disincentivize you from drawing that 1. And because of that possibility, I like this better than flat drawing 2, because I also think that you can glean information from the other player based on what they chose. Or maybe they just want you to think that you can. Either way, it is at least more interesting than flat out drawing 2, especially since it offsets the straight draw that this faction has. The second double feature gives your rival a Sophie's Choice. There will be power and there will be cards. It's just a question of who gets what. And your rival gets to choose, which makes it an action you'd likely play first. If they draw a card, the elites could potentially get you 2 cards and 3 power for their 1 card. But 3 cards alone is a strong draw, and there is still 2 power, and it's possible to pigeonhole them on a board like with Pumping Iron. The choices are fairly similar based on board presences, which makes those minute differences matter tremendously, and it's a tough choice to make in the game, but an easy choice for a double feature. Scripted Fate offers another choice, though much more straightforward. You choose 2 cards to potentially play for free, with an extra action to follow, like a more interesting time loop. Not to keep comparing these cards to existing cards, but while time loop is stronger, I do think that this is more interesting because it engages the other player and potentially conveys information. The different names is important to prevent it from becoming a gimmick. However, I do wonder what stops the player from playing the other revealed action with the extra action. They have the flexibility to, but don't have to and can react to the situation, since the extra action is bankable. Perhaps the Sphinx always wins either way. Perhaps the answer is that the other action gets shuffled in, but you draw a card and play an extra action in return. We see similar themes with Reawakening, because it uses the other player as a balancing factor against the card. You will get a minion back either way, but if they want to delay it by a turn, it's going to cost them. And because the Great Old One can potentially play it that turn, I think that choice matters extensively. Given that the Sphinx has rival drawing cards, they may be more incentivized to do the stall. There's a particular card in the Sphinx that stands out, and that's Insatiable. Insatiable has the chance to be recurred with a draw effect, and it's easy to think that this just means renewable access to power. But I think it does more than that. It adds a perpetual choice that your rival has to consider. Rather than being open-ended, often with no information, I feel like the guaranteed presence of Insatiable can influence the decision, which can be used to your advantage. And I'm not sure if that is a conscious or unconscious effect, which I find super interesting. The final action I want to talk about is Gilded Armor. As I read most of the Sphinx cards, I had mentally decided that I was going to reject this faction if it didn't include a card like this, and I'm glad that it did have one, because it adds payoff to that draw. Gilded Armor is a threat-style card that you should be afraid of from draw. Not only does a draw include its chances of being played, but it also increases its effectiveness. In a slightly altered form, this could have been a double feature, but in its current form, it adds an interesting wrinkle to the choice people make. For example, drawing 3 cards on no string attached could mean 2 power for Gilded Armor, which when combined with the 2 power that your rival places is 4 power added, and a minimum 3, matching the output of the bottom half. However, that bottom half could also be boosted by the arbitrators, which means that the power is very much an equation, creating pressure on the rival to choose the best outcome. This could create analysis paralysis, but it also creates interaction, which I find to be a cure for analysis paralysis because it makes the turns interesting and engaging, players responding to other players. Now that we've seen a sample of the Sphinx cards, I wanted to circle back to the Great Old One because there are 3 possibilities that make the Great Old One interesting to me. Either my distribution is fairly even, or I have more of one type than the other, and I think that you can choose factions of each variety to add intrigue because of that double bluffing. If I'm playing Kaiju, when I have very few minions, would I dare name minions? Or would I try to convince them that I wouldn't take the obvious route of actions? Given that Sphinx cards provide utility, extreme draw power, and moderate power boosts, that's something that everyone can use and lets those factions be themselves. Personally, I think that's more fun to devise pairings around specific moments for a faction like this. Just imagine giving someone a choice between Rotary Slug Thrower and Agromotive, or Augmentation and Rampage. Maybe the choices are discreetly different, like Zeppelin and Scrap Diving. Admittedly, this faction is harder to do testing of solos because it requires the player's personality, and playing with other players is harder during the holiday, but I'd love to see this doubled down with goblins. While I have tried other combos, I haven't tried this one because I ran out of time, but imagine the choice between a little help and he who smelt it. You have no idea what is going to happen, so what does your rival choose? I'd love to see their thought process in that situation. But Scripted Fate is only one card, whereas the Great Old One is repeatable, so I'm looking for one of 2 things. Either minion recursion to keep a steady stream of minions going, or cast-friendly cards. I think that this is really important to the Great Old One, because too many terminal actions will reduce the chance of picking actions unless you try to sneak one through for augmentation into Rampage. One thing I noticed about the Great Old One is that cast really determines how often you can outsmart your opponent. While this is extremely difficult to simulate, I did write a small evaluation criteria that I used in my games as a proof of concept, and one of the things that I noticed was that a faction will often be forced to name Minion because the Sphinx cards usually add a lot of cards, which just adds more to my hand. Most of the power that they add is temporary, but they do have some power counter actions, albeit ones you don't necessarily control. I think that this is where Gilded Armor becomes a real threat if you think that they aren't 2 terminal actions away. So I was looking at factions that are very cast-friendly in terms of power counters or modifiers. Giant Ant and Cyborg Apes came to mind. What I really liked about Giant Ants was the escalation of the Royal Sphinx with respect to drawing the good ant cards. The Royal Sphinx is like playing Who Wants to Live Forever each talent, as you either get a power counter you can remove for a card or just getting the card. And if you get cards, you start worrying about We Will Rock You, but the power counters are also feeding those very actions and the Sphinx have great draw. With Cyborg Apes, I like how you could really bait someone with Juiced Up, because you think that I play an action, but instead I play Clyde 2.0 to recur Juiced Up, or I play Baboom for Cyber Evolution. I think you could play Sphinxes for the extra terminal action, but I'd be cautious. I think cast-friendly actions are much more interesting. Finally, in the craziest game I had with them, I paired them with Vikings because I wanted to see how using other players' cards could affect the decision making. And all I have to say is that you should try this, because the Viking negative card draw is really offset by the Sphinx card draw, which might actually be too much in its own context, and Raiding Party was a cast-friendly action that was a real threat for the Great Old One. Sphinxes may make my head hurt on occasion, but they are fun, and they have a nice collection of abilities for what they need. Cards to make the choices agonizing, power counters to have a safe action play, and specials to make it interesting in the end. I feel like I could talk a lot more about the metagaming that goes into this thought process, but I'd rather let you discover it on your own. What do you think of the Sphinxes, and who would you want to try with them? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, be sure to like and subscribe, let's shut it down.